we've got some special people on the call today here. We're going to open with Allister Cox, who is working for the FIH and is their specialist in this matter. Everything that's related to facilities and especially artificial grass, obviously. That all comes down to Allister. So tell us a little bit about why do we make this move to dry artificial grass?
Hi, Winston. Thanks for inviting me to join you today. As you've already mentioned, hockey's been played on synthetic turf since 1976, the Montreal Olympics, and it was found at a very early stage that the performance on the surfaces was far superior on a wet surface. Um, Particularly in those early days when everybody was playing on a nylon carpet. When it was dry, it was quite sticky, high grip, not very satisfactory at all. So the sport recognised early on watering the fields was advantageous, improved the playing qualities, allowed the players to excel and to show their skills, and for the game to develop into what we see today around the world. And in the early 90s, the FIH wrote its first standards defining the qualities required from the surfaces and the fields that are used at the different levels of the game, and particularly at the elite level. And those standards are now used across the world to ensure that fields are consistent and provide satisfactory venues for high level hockey. And from the early 90s, the FIH standards have said you had to play on a wet surface, you had to have an irrigation system, the fields had to be watered. However, it's become increasingly clear that the use of water is becoming more challenging in many parts of the world. Water is becoming a valuable and scarce commodity. Some data that we looked at showed that by 2040, most of the major hockey playing nations in Europe and around the world will either have a medium to high risk or a high risk of being what they call in a water scarcity situation. That is basically where demand exceeds capacity. So there are potentially going to be water shortages. That's obviously going to have an impact on the sport. If we can't provide water to sustain life, it's not good to be pouring thousands of litres of water onto a plastic turf to enable people to play a sport. The cost of the irrigation systems is also a major barrier to people building venues and fields for the high levels of the game. An irrigation system is probably the best part of €100,000. That's a big expenditure for a club, a community, or anybody wishing to invest, and particularly in the developing parts of the hockey community where they have aspirations to host higher level tournaments, suddenly facing large costs to build these fields. And then there's the ongoing cost of the water. In many parts of the world, water is expensive. You have to pay for the supply, you have to pay for the disposal. So again, that makes it difficult for people to invest in the top surfaces. And then I think finally, we're all becoming very aware of the need to protect the environment, to become carbon neutral. Looking at CO2 emissions, 1 cubic meter of water produces the production of 1 cubic meter of water produces about 3 kilos of CO2. Each time we water a field, we're putting on 5 or 6 cubic meters of water. So we are using water that is creating CO2, which is obviously contributing to the climate crisis that we see in many parts of the world. So looking at all those factors, our executive board in 2018 came to the conclusion that we needed to start to transition away from playing on wet fields. If the sport was to grow, to prosper, to develop, and to have a sustainable future, we needed to move in a slightly different direction. So at our Congress in 2018, it was announced that we basically threw out a challenge to the synthetic turf industry. Can you develop surfaces that allow hockey to be played in the way it is currently played without the use of significant quantities of water or no water at all? So looking ahead, we've now set the target of the World Cups in 2026, which obviously will be now in Belgium and the Netherlands. And probably the bigger target was the LA Olympics in 2028. We all know California has a big water shortage issue. So it would have been a challenge to go into California and ask for 4 fields or 3 fields that were requiring vast quantities of water 3 or 4 times a day for the duration of the hockey tournament. What we have done in that intervening period is, as I mentioned earlier, we have standards that define the qualities required from the turf. Now, those standards up until now, because we said it had to be wet, we didn't need to measure things that the water influences. If it's wet, it's okay. We all know that. But if we are removing the water from the system, we need to verify that the performance of the surfaces is satisfactory and what the sport desires as far as possible. So we commissioned research in 2020, which was undertaken by one of the accredited test institutes, a company called Lavosport. It's based in the UK. And they worked in conjunction with Loughborough University, again in the UK, who have a lot of experience in doing player feedback assessments, etc., etc. So they started off by setting up some focus groups to talk to players to say, what is it you like about wet surfaces? What is it you dislike about dry surfaces? To get an understanding of what we're talking about. We obviously had an idea, but we wanted that verified independently, and we wanted to get feedback from current players. So the focus groups produced a group of answers. We then put a questionnaire together and we shared that with all of the Olympic squads who went to Tokyo in 2021. So I think a small benefit of the lockdown and the pandemic was with the players locked in their bedrooms in Tokyo, they had time to complete our questionnaires. So we got over 230 responses from players, both genders, all positions on the field. It was statistically a really good representation. So we now have a way of measuring the properties that the water influences. And ideally, we will be able to set criteria that basically says on a wet field, you get this level of performance. If you make the same measurements on a dry field, on a field without water, we're actually using the term non-irrigated, because I think it's very important to say at the outset, we don't want to end up like cricket or tennis. At the first time we get a shower of rain, everybody has to come off the field and go and sit in the grandstands. We will play on wet fields. What we don't want to do is artificially water the fields. So non-irrigated is now the term we are using, but everyone's
Duly
commonly
noted.
referring to dry field.
Duly noted.
Yeah. To what degree can we compromise on certain aspects to achieve the objective of playing on non-irrigated surfaces at the elite level moving forward without making a significant change to the way the game is played? The sport has evolved to what it is today. We have no intention of moving it backwards to where it was 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Jeroen, as a player who's still an active player at the highest level, you've already been through different types of fields with different conditions and more slippery, dry pitches, wet pitches. What is needed from a player's perspective to make this a smooth transition?
It's actually quite interesting for me because I'm even though I'm the youngest in this call, I consider myself a very old player. So, but it's good because I can see. Look, I grew up in countries where hockey wasn't very big. I grew up in Budapest, in Hungary, and in Vienna, Austria, where I played on grass till I was 16, and I can still remember offside. I played sand pretty much 90% of the time. So I'm very aware of the importance of getting pitches to be accessible all around the world. However, I wrote a few things down that jumped in my mind. And the first thing that comes to mind is, so you have speed and you have safety. So obviously safety is the big thing here, which is the main conclusion. I mean, we can talk for hours, but at the end of the day, like Adam said, the well-being of the players is obviously the most important, because we can't have people get injured on the pitch, on live TV, because it's just, well, that's not good for the sport. And then the speed is something that I think I don't worry about the most, because when we had the transition, I mean, I've played on wonderful natural grass fields where I really felt like I was playing at Wimbledon, which was very quick, and I've played on terrible water pitches. So the speed thing is something that I don't worry about too much, because we had the transition from grass to sand based. Then there was the nylon era, where it was so quick, and it was actually drier than pitches are now. So if I look at as a player, if my socks are usually wet after a game, because the layer of water is quite high on the pitch. And in the nylon pitches, or the AstroTurf, I'm not sure what the right name is, the ball would be flat. You'd be like playing on a snooker table, and it felt like it was wet. And even if it got a bit dry, it was still okay to play on. And now pitches are wetter. So especially the polytan fields, the one we use in World Cups and in Olympics, the blue pitches. So they're very wet, and there's a lot of water which they need, and they're a bit softer. So the speed has been going up and down in the last 20 years. So that's something I don't worry too much about. However, the safety, yeah, that's the big one here, because there are even players now that are covering their knees with tights, because even with the water-based pitches, sometimes skin injuries is a thing. And what we actually want to see in our game is, we want to see diving tackles. We want to see players diving to the second post and getting on their stomach and getting on their knees, and because that's the sensation of the sport. However, what I wrote down is the performance side. And then there's also the planet side. So the planet side is interesting. I myself am interested also in the planet side, because I have a YouTube channel where I try to teach hockey all over the world, and I get messages from people all over the world, whether it's Nigeria or Kenya or Tibet, and people are playing on the most the surfaces you've never even seen, on gravel and things like that. And this sport needs to be how do you say, attractive to the planet, not only in a sustainable way, but also in accessibility, because it will help us grow the sport. So that's the other side of performance. So on the one hand, you have speed and safety, and on the other hand, you have planet and performance. So long story short, I have no doubt that these pitches can be quick. However, and that we can play on them, but the safety aspect is going to be the biggest challenge. And yeah, so that's my point of view on.
Allister, some reactions from FIH maybe to these concerns.
I think we're very aware that the first versions of these products that we're starting to see coming out into the market, Colin mentioned the prototypes that his company have. You may recall the FIH ran a Hockey Fives tournament in Lausanne last year on a temporary field. That was on a non-watered, dry, if you like, hockey surface. That was the first version of the product from Polytan. So we are starting to get experience, and during that Hockey Fives tournament, most of the time it was hot and sunny. It did rain one day, so that actually gave us a good contrast. People said it wasn't an issue adjusting between the two, which was positive. And equally, we didn't get significant complaints or concerns about the carpet burns. So that, again, was reassuring. But there are solutions out there, we believe, to address these issues. And ultimately, in an ideal world, we will define the criteria for a global surface, and all we're going to do is remove the requirement that you have to water the field to provide that performance. So at the top level, if people want to provide a field that uses water, they can continue to do that. We've said that we will move towards non-irrigated surfaces, because we think that's the future, and we need to create that momentum.
But when will we have a first pitch that is available for high performance testing?
I think we would like, and we will organise, as I mentioned, we've already commissioned Loughborough University to help us, but we will need to arrange for players from the Dutch squad, the Belgian squad, the Australian squad, whoever it may be, to go to these venues to play on them. And we will need the assistance of the national associations, the high performance coaches, Adam and his colleagues around the world, to ensure that happens, because clearly their expectation is going to be very different to a typical community player, and we need that high level feedback.
For me, as the reason why I have so much passion for this sport is because our sport is actually the ultimate combination between So the physicality, and then the technical skills, or technique, and then also tactics. And on the other hand, I realize that we are in fact not a sport that has the resources that some other big sports do. So we need to be realistic as well. So I'm going to be very dramatic and leave it lovely in the middle right there. But yeah, it's an interesting discussion, and time will tell how these prototypes are. And I obviously wish you guys the best of luck with the development of that. And if you ever need someone to test a pitch in Australia, you can always call me. Happy to go.
Happy to fly in. New Zealand is
Yeah, happy to fly in. Yeah. I mean, I don't have time, but I can do it.
Yeah, absolutely. To touch on those subjects as well. So, but thanks very much for sharing your thoughts on this, and yeah, I'm sure we'll follow it up. Thanks, and bye bye.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Bye bye.